AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former senior U.S. intelligence officers. And today I have a new friend and former colleague by the name of Barry Broman. After serving as a Marine officer during combat in Vietnam, Barry joined the CIA and had a series of interesting and exciting tours, primarily in Southeast Asia. He was a chief of station twice, a deputy chief of station once. He has some great stories to tell. He is a sought-after speaker, a well-recognized author and photographer, and has created 9 film documentaries. He's got a bachelor's degree in poli-sci and a master's degree in Southeast Asian studies. And he's got a brand new book out called Indochina. Barry, welcome to AFIO Now.
Very, very good to be here, Jim.
You had a very interesting early life starting in Bangkok. Tell our audience a little bit about that.
Okay. I was a military brat. My father served in World War II as a glider pilot in the Army Air Corps and then switched to the Air Force. He was an architect by profession, but he kept getting called back to active duty, so he decided to stay for 30. And in 1962, he was assigned as civil engineer advisor to the Royal Thai Air Force. At that time, I just finished my freshman year at the University of Illinois in Champaign, where I was going to be a South American specialist, spoke Spanish. And my father said, look, why don't you drop out for 1 year and come out to Thailand and see what that's like. Earlier, I'd spent 4 years in England when my father was at the RAF Manston on the Channel. So I dropped out. I had a scholarship. I dropped out and I went to Bangkok. And this is the summer of '62. And Bangkok was a much smaller, much quieter town than it is today. We had an active military assistance program. My father was building runways. He was a civil engineer in the Air Force. And so one of the perks that he was a member of the Royal Bangkok Sports Club. They had lawn tennis courts. So it was tennis all day and then party all night with other military brats that were there for the summer. And after about 10 days, my father said, this isn't quite what I had in mind for you in your year off. If you don't get a job, you're going back to Champaign in the fall. I had few skills at that time, but one of them, I'd been a photographer on the Daily Illini. My editor was Roger Ebert, the film critic. And I was in a fraternity. One of my fraternity brothers was Dick Butkus, the football player. And at Illinois, I learned quite a bit about photography. And so I presented myself to the Associated Press on Pat Pong Road in Bangkok one day with clippings from the Daily Illini. The bureau chief was a Filipino named Tony Escoda with degrees from Yale and masters at Columbia and just a super journalist, and was hoping that they would take me on in some capacity as a photographer. And Tony looked at my clippings and he said, can you start tomorrow? Because the U.S. Marines had just landed in northeastern Thailand. There was a crisis in Laos. AP had a local stringer, a Thai fellow, who had almost no English. And so they needed me up Korat Air Base the next day. And that's how I got my start with AP. So I spent my year in Bangkok with AP. I had assignments to Vietnam and to Cambodia. And I even had some time off to work as a stills photographer on a Tarzan movie up in Chiang Mai for about 10 weeks in '63. So that's how I got to Bangkok. And after 10 days, I said, I'm going to be an Indochina hand. To hell with Latin America. And the rest is history.
That's a great start. Barry, of course, you joined the Marine Corps, had combat tours of duty with the Marines in Vietnam. Tell our audience a little bit about being part of hotel company.
Okay. After my year in Bangkok, I went back to college at University of Washington. We're from Washington State. My dad was UW class of 35. So I majored in political science. I was in Naval ROTC, and I opted for the Marine option. So when I graduated in '67, I was commissioned in the Marine Corps, and the Marines decided to let me stay for another year for a master's degree. So while I was in grad school, one of my professors, a great old China hand, asked if I'd ever heard of the CIA or considered them as a possible employer. And frankly, I hadn't, and I said so. And he said, look, you've got the kind of credentials that the agency's looking for. Let me introduce you to a local recruiter. So I met the fellow, very good, and I was getting my master's, and I had Thai language already in grad school. And he said, you're the kind of guy we're looking for. And I said, wait, I'm a Marine lieutenant. I'm going to war. And he took his card out, and he said, here's my card. If you live, call me 6 months before you get out. So that's how I met the agency. But after grad school, I went to Quantico Officers Basic School, became an infantry officer, and in '69, I was sent to Westpac, Western Pacific, Vietnam. I was assigned to the 1st Marine Division, headquartered in Da Nang. I was in the 5th Marine Regiment, 5th Marines. We were the westerlymost regiment of the Marines in Vietnam. We're up on the Lao border almost, because there was heavy infiltration from North Vietnamese army down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and into Vietnam. And one of their main targets was Da Nang Air Base, which was the busiest airfield in the world, surpassing O'Hare in Chicago. And so we were the point regiment out there. And I was assigned to H Company, Hotel Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. I started as a platoon commander, but being I was a first lieutenant, thanks to grad school, after a couple of months, I was moved up as the company executive officer, number 2 in the infantry company. And the way the Marines worked in the war, we had a 13-month tour, and if you're an officer, you had a split tour. You could figure on a split tour, which means half in the bush and half on staff. That way everybody gets a chance to get shot at. And ideally, you'd have your first 6 months or 6.5 months in the bush and the second in the rear. So I spent my time on the line with the 5th Marines. And then later, my second half of the tour was as a civil affairs officer in Da Nang, after which I extended my tour 6 months. And part of the extension, I was sent to Bangkok as the MACV liaison officer, which mainly meant I was the R&R officer to watch over the R&R program, which was funded by Vietnam but handled by local military, U.S. military. So, you want to talk a little bit about the hotel company?
Sure.
Okay, normally a Marine infantry company in those days was about 240. Hotel company, when I got there, was about 160. We had men in the hospital. We had people coming and going. My platoon should have been 46. It was 24, including my machine gunners and a corpsman attached. So we were thin all the time. We took fairly heavy casualties, mostly from booby traps, but sometimes in fixed battles, the biggest of which was in my time. We caught an NVA regiment in the open trying to cross the river heading to Da Nang. 2-5 and the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, and 1st Battalion got together, and in a 36-hour engagement probably killed 600 or so, with a lot of supporting arms from our artillery and air. But mostly it was a lot of patrolling, up in the mountains, in the paddies. I wrote, as the XO, I wrote 34 letters to next of kin about their sons being killed in action. Probably one of the tougher things I had to do. But I enjoyed the Corps. I had great company commanders. In the 7 months I was there, I had 3 company commanders. One was badly wounded, but he lived. And another company commander was full-blooded Kiowa Indian, and a really great guy, really tough guy. And then just a whole bunch of great troops and a surprising number of foreign nationals. We had Germans, and there was a great young Irishman, Lance Corporal Peter Nee. He was killed in action, and eventually I found his grave on the west coast of Ireland, a Marine Corps grave, put flowers on it.
Barry, your first tour of duty after you joined the CIA was in war-torn Cambodia. Tell our audience a little bit about your experiences there.
Okay, when I joined the agency, I aimed to be a member of the East Asia Division, and that wasn't difficult because I had my time in Asia already, my master's, my Thai language. And I was actually I was counting on going to Bangkok. I'd been offered a job, Bangkok Station, which was very active at the time. This would have been 73, 72. In 72, after I finished my time at the farm, training to be a clandestine service officer, I was on the Cambodia desk serving under a fellow named Serge Taub. And Serge said, no, you don't want to go to Bangkok. You want to go to Cambodia. Cambodia is where the action is. And we had a small station in Phnom Penh. And so I got my orders changed from Bangkok to Phnom Penh. It was one of the best moves I ever made. And I was there from 73 till it fell in April 75. The city itself was surrounded pretty much by the Khmer Rouge. The lifeline was the Mekong River. We had convoys coming up the Mekong, and that was cut around January 75. So they flew in. There was an airlift of food coming into Cambodia, Stretch 8 commercial aircraft, and they were bringing in, I'm going to say, some tons of rice every day, and a plane would land, and they would kick the rice off on pallets and on wheels, so that you touch down and kick the rice out and then take off. You never shut down. And so you could offload, I'm going to say, 8 or 9 tons of rice in pallets in a couple minutes and then took off. That would happen all day. The Khmer Rouge were within mortar range of the airfield. I would come into Phnom Penh on an aircraft. We had agency aircraft in and out from Saigon and from Bangkok. And they would corkscrew in. You could see mortar rounds impacting as we came down to land. There was no customs. There was nothing formal. You got off. The station had a vehicle out there with packs to get on the aircraft. They would take their flak jacket off and give it to you. They'd get on the plane, and we would head in for town, and the plane would take off. And so that's how it was in Penn. We had a small station. We had a handful of officers in Phnom Penh, and in the countryside, we had a couple dozen officers, singletons, operating out of provincial capitals. This was at the request of Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State at the time. He wanted to know what was going on outside Phnom Penh, and these guys were all handpicked. They spoke either French and or Cambodian. And because French was the language we all spoke, that was the official language. And as the war got tighter and tighter, the noose was tightening on Phnom Penh. We were taking up to 200 rockets a day in the city. You learn very quickly the difference between incoming and outgoing. Those of us with Vietnam experience, which actually was quite a few, it wasn't hard. We didn't lose any of our officers killed in action, although there was a couple of narrow escapes. And as the Congress cut off support to the Cambodian government, it wasn't a matter of military loss in the field. The Khmer had some pretty good troops. And in fact, there were a bunch of Cambodians from South Vietnam, known as Khmer Rouge. They were the best fighters. They'd fought for the French in the French wars, and they fought for us in Cambodia, and they're excellent guys. So as the noose got tighter, it was we drew down. We pulled out officers. We burnt the station files down to, we had a burnout time of about 30 minutes toward the end. And when the money was cut off, we knew for sure we had limited time. And so we sent people out. We got some assets out. And the Marine Corps had a plan, Eagle Pull. That was the evacuation of the embassy. And they had, I'll get that. I left on the last agency fixed wing aircraft. I took out documents and some personnel. And there's a picture in my book of a baby being lifted onto this CH-46. That baby made it out. About 5 days later, they called for the Marines, and they came in on choppers. They had space on the choppers for, I'm going to say, over 600, but only about half took seats. We had the embassy. We took Allied embassy people out. Also, we took dependents out. But we had offered the Cambodian government in the last minute before the choppers came in. We convoked a cabinet meeting and invited the Khmer cabinet, senior officers, families to come out. They had a meeting. They voted to stay. They didn't come out. We had at least 300 empty seats, and those people were all killed within hours, if not days, of the surrender, because there was a quiet time of about 3 or 4 days after the Americans pulled out that the Khmer Rouge walked in. Some of the Cambodians fought to the last round. Just before I left, I was up on the northern front, which would have been about 4 kilometers from Phnom Penh. I was visiting the parachute regiment, one of the best units. And they were taking fire from 2 sides when I got to the command post. I was with the Associated Press bureau chief, Matt Frangiola. And we wanted to get a fix on the situation because the pressure was heavy coming down toward Phnom Penh from the north. And we talked to the battalion commander. He was a captain. Battalion should have had 510 men and officers. They had 46. And he said, we're almost out of ammunition. And I've told my boys a month ago not to get haircuts, because when the Khmer Rouge come in, I told them to take their uniforms off and try to make it back to their villages. I said, what about you? He says, I've got a wife and 2 kids. We're going to pull pins on 2 hand grenades, and they killed themselves. So they fought essentially the last rounds in Cambodia.
What a story. Barry and I discussed off camera several months ago. I did an interview with Chip Beck, who's got a great book, Final Days of Heroes, about one of the upcountry officers. And it's a similarly interesting but also tragic story. Barry, switching gears just a little bit, you had quite a bit of experience with Air America. Tell our audience a little bit about that.
Okay, Air America was the CIA's private airline. They were great guys. They followed in the footsteps of an airline called China Air Transport, CAT. And CAT came out of China. It was run by Claire Chennault, the guy that founded the Flying Tigers back in the late 30s. And CAT became a CIA airline, and then that morphed into Air America, which was a private airline owned by the CIA. My bumper sticker on my car right now it's an Air America bumper plate holder, and it says, Air America, the world's most shot at airline, because they took a lot of fire in a lot of countries, and it was unarmed. This was strictly transport, flying men and materiel, and in many cases ammunition in. I flew with Air America in Vietnam, in Cambodia a lot, and in Thailand. And they flew right to the very end. The last mission, Saigon, 30th of April, 75, Air America was taking people out, the ships coming in, taking them out, and then it fell, and that was the end of Air America. And I have a number of good buddies, Air America guys, and I just wish I had a tape recorder in the bars when I was drinking with half a dozen Air America guys. They've got the best stories ever. And in this book, this memoir I wrote, I tell the story about an Air America shoot down in Laos in 1974, I believe. Obviously, I wasn't there. I didn't serve in Laos, but Air America had, I believe at the time, about 200 aircraft flying mostly out of Udon, Thailand on the Lao border. But we had a lot of officers in country. We supported, I'm going to say 30,000 Hmong and other tribal groups. We had Thai volunteers, another 30,000. They were all supported by Air America. And some of these sites, the Lima sites, Lima for Laos, were small and very dangerous, a lot of times in the mountains. Very difficult to get fixed wing in aircraft in, but a lot of the aircraft were choppers, helicopters. So one little story told to me by Jim Mullen, Air America guy, ex-Marine also, took place. There was a site. It was a very tall, thin mountain up on the North Vietnamese border with a U.S. Air Force team of intercept people, intercept or radar. But whenever the NVA would launch or missions, the Air Force monitored that and they reported. So it was actually a CIA site with the Hmong hill tribes defenders, these Air Force techs, very dangerous. That was Lima Site 85, I believe. And at one point, the North Vietnamese launched air assault against Lima Site 85 using AN-2 biplanes. Okay, we're talking the state-of-the-art 1930s aircraft or 20s, but they configured these aircraft to drop mortar shells straight down and try to blow up the facility at Lima Site 85. And one day, a Huey, Air America Bell helicopter, classic Huey, was in the air when the NVA launched a raid. Now, as I said, these are unarmed aircraft. This is transport aircraft entirely. However, in this particular aircraft, piloted by Captain Ted Moore, he had a flight mechanic on board with him, Glenn Woods. And Glenn had an AK-47 automatic weapon. And this was because we lost a number of aircraft, we lost a number of people shot down, and some made it out and some didn't. But the idea being the AK was there in case they went down. As part of their exfiltration, Glenn had this rifle. And so when the North Vietnamese biplane showed up, the Huey's faster than the biplane, and there were actually two biplanes. And I think one got shot down by ground fire from probably Hmong tribals. But Captain Moore went after the AN-2, and his flight mechanic, Glenn Wood, pulled out his AK, and they shot down the aircraft and shot down the North Vietnamese aircraft. And there's a painting that someone showed me belonged to Air America. And that picture is in the book. So that's my Air America shoot down story.
That's a great story. Barry, who was Starfish?
Okay, now we're in Europe in the 80s. In my book, I very often use pseudonyms for officers, and because of the ground rules for publishing, all of my books are approved by the agency for publishing. I often don't use the cities involved because of many reasons, all of them good reasons. So this is a story about CIA case officer, I'll call him Jerome. and Jerome was serving at a large European station. And his chief of station was one of the mandarins of EUR division, a fellow I will call Kinloch. And one day, now Jerome was an Asian officer, Asia hand. He spoke Chinese and other Asian languages, and he was in this European country targeting officers or diplomats from those Asian countries. So as a result, and he worked directly for the deputy chief of station. He didn't spend much time with the chief of station, who was a very senior officer, GS-18, a sort of major general equivalent, excellent fellow. But one day, Jerome was convoked by Kinloch, and that was rare. And Jerome knew he was in trouble when Kinloch said, "Jerome, you're the best officer I have in my station." And Jerome knew he was in for trouble, and he was right. It turned out that there was an agent, a senior sensitive agent of the station, and his cryptonym was Starfish. And the true names were never mentioned. And so everyone, and very, very few people, even in the station, knew of the existence of Starfish, who had been an asset of the CIA for a long time. And Jerome, who was a fairly senior officer himself, he was a GS-14 lieutenant colonel, he'd never heard of Starfish. So the COS briefed him on the operation and said, "I'd like you to take the case." And this was really a surprise to Jerome. And he said, "May I ask why? I mean, you've got a number of officers senior to me with the better language skills that this guy speaks than me. Why me?" And Kinloch said, "Well, headquarters thinks that Starfish has been not turned, but discovered. He's been blown to his internal service." And Jerome says, "Well, that's too bad. Why? What have I got to do with this?" Well, and then Kinloch, who is a smooth, very senior officer, sort of said, "I'm not ordering you to take this case. I'm offering you this case. This is a career-enhancing case. And I know you've handled tough cases. I know you've recruited important people, all of which was true." But immediately, Jerome sensed that he was expendable to the station, and certainly to EU division. And so Kinloch said, "I'm not ordering you, but I want you to read the file. This is a hell of a case I'm offering you here. And then you get back to me." So Jerome there's 3 thick folders on this case, went back some years. And it was a very, very interesting case. And so Jerome went back to the chief and he said, "Okay, I'll take the case, but I have conditions." Kinloch said, "What? Anything?" So, "Well, I won't meet him in country. I mean, I'll meet him and I'll debrief him. I'll get the take." The take was primarily documentary. He didn't have to sit down and take a lot of notes, and very, very voluminous documentary stuff. And he said, "I'll meet him out of country. Therefore, the host service, if they're onto him, they can't touch him or me out of country." And the chief said, "Fine." And so he took the case, met him several times, and meanwhile, the station had been looking for a safe house that Jerome could use. And they found a tremendous place outside the country. And so the case went on for some time. And the agent, Starfish, was very, very strongly pro-American. And on day one, when Jerome took the case, he said to Starfish, "People think that you've been discovered and that you could be rolled up." And Starfish said, "Look, if they knew, I would know. And if they arrest me, I'll never talk." So that was his attitude. But he'd been warned. And that was the reason they was being met out of country. And he said, no problem. They're not on me. And Starfish had been around a long time, and he had developed a network. It wasn't a singleton. He had a team of people. They may not have even been witting where this information was going. But anyway, the case went well. That after some months, Chief calls in Jerome and says, Jerome, you gotta terminate him and fire him. And Jerome said, Jesus, look at the take. He's being met outside the country. It's good stuff. And Jerome said, it's not, Kinloch said, it's not my call. Headquarters, they don't want to take the heat if this thing blows. So terminate him. So they arranged, there's all sorts of contingency plans, and Jerome contacted Starfish and arranged for a quick brush pass. And this took place in country, late at night. Hundreds of thousands of dollars changed hands because he was calling in his escrow account and he was being paid off. And so it was a very quick meeting. Jerome was very apologetic. Starfish said, it's been a good run. I'm leaving. I'm retiring anyway, but my team is still there. If you ever need me, he handed him a card. He had his phone number and his contact instructions. And so they made a quick plan, a recontact plan if needed. And so that was the termination of Starfish. So Jerome is in headquarters maybe 2 years later. And in a hallway, he bumps into the officer that he picked up Starfish from, the CUR officer. And he saw Jerome, who wasn't actually stationed in headquarters, but was in town. He said, Jerome, come here. And he takes him aside and he said, you remember that guy that we used to run? And Jerome said, yeah, he's back. Because the users, the people who used this intelligence, they had to have it. And there was a big fight. I don't know the details. And Jerome didn't know the details. But he was back. They just decided they needed him, and they got him back, and that's Starfish.
Great story. Barry, you finally did get back to Thailand later on. Tell our audience a little bit about your experiences serving in the station in Bangkok.
Well, when Cambodia fell in 1975, I already had orders to go to Bangkok. My tour was cut short by the Khmer Rouge by 2 weeks. But I went to Thailand and spent almost 5 years there. And I followed Cambodia for a while, but I also went after other targets. It was a very successful 5 years career-wise. And I had a lot of friends, people I'd known earlier, people I met during the war. And so I served there for about 5 years and then came back in 1990. I was a deputy in a large station in Southeast Asia, and I got an invitation from Chief of Station Bangkok, Billy Huff, who I'd worked with earlier, ex-Marine, outstanding guy, China hand. Billy says, I want you to come up to Bangkok and run this paramilitary program. We had been supporting the non-communist Cambodian resistance against the Vietnamese puppet government in Phnom Penh. And Billy offered me the job to go up and run the project. Headquarters had given me a very career-enhancing job, and so it's just some back channel traffic. And headquarters finally said, "Okay, you could go to Bangkok if you want, but it won't be as good for your career." So that was the very least of my concerns. I was delighted to go back to Bangkok and work the Cambodia project out of Bangkok. We had about 30,000 troops that we were supporting, the Thai and other allies. And we won. In 91, the Vietnamese signed a peace agreement, a ceasefire agreement in Paris, and that led to free and fair elections in Cambodia, and our people won. But so that was more of a paramilitary project. Going inside, I had a team of about half a dozen Americans, and we were supporting two groups. There were the royalists of King Sihanouk, who had earlier been with the Khmer Rouge, a very difficult person, I must say. And then the nationalists under a fellow named Son San, who'd been a prime minister, and they were the royalists and the nationalists, two different groups. We supported them both. They were allied against the Vietnamese regime, and it worked out very well. One of my conditions, I didn't have a condition, but our ambassador was a tough guy, Dan O'Donoghue, and Dan did not allow station officers to go inside Cambodia. He'd support them from Thailand. And I said to Dan, I'd known Dan from my earlier days in Bangkok. I said, you can't run a war by mail, okay? You got to have people on the ground. For one thing, it looks bad.
Sure.
You send people to die, and you're not there. So I said, I've got to go in, and my people have to go in, especially our logs people. They're delivering all sorts of equipment, gear, and it's worth money, and you got to make sure it's spent properly, and it's that. So anyway, Ambassador Donahue said, okay. So we did go in. We were not supposed to RON, remain overnight. In and out. We had choppers and fixed wing aircraft. It was very good. It was very useful, and we did go in. And there wasn't a war of attrition, killing people and holding ground. It was more of a psychological warfare because the Khmer traditionally hate the Vietnamese, and they were fighting against the Vietnamese regime of Cambodian puppets, we would say. So it was more of a Psy war, not more. It was every bit a Psy war effort. We had clandestine radios. There's a picture of one of my Cambodian DJs, a cute little lady, broadcasting from a site outside Cambodia. And we had people writing songs and original music, and it was a very successful program. So the idea was to wear down. This is part of Bill Casey's idea of taking the war to the communists. Cambodia was just one of them, but worked out well.
Well, the name of the book is Indochina Hand. We've only touched on maybe a half a dozen of many more stories that are there. I have read it and thoroughly enjoyed it, and I recommend it to our audience. And I want to thank Barry Broman for a fascinating interview.
Jim, thank you for having me.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.